Hello and welcome to the Digital Insight, the technology and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Welcome to the Digital Insight, the official podcast series of Interface and CPO strategy magazines. Today, I'm joined by Natalia Graves. Natalia is an experienced CPO professional and has recently overseen a procurement transformation at Veeam Software. In this episode, Natalia explores the complexities of a procurement transformation, and she also emphasizes just how important it is for the modern procurement professionals to look beyond procurement and understand the wider business strategy. Natalia, welcome to the Digital Insight.
Thank you, Dale. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be part of your podcast, and a really pleasure to be here. So I appreciate you inviting me.
No, perfect. And so, most recently, in terms of your career, you've worked with Veeam, and you recently led a sort of a procurement transformation while there. Can you tell me a bit about your sort of scope and your responsibilities at Veeam, and really what you were tasked with doing once you joined the company?
Absolutely. At Veeam, I was tasked to look after procurement sourcing and global travel operations department. I was really brought in to continue an evolution journey to further develop and build and lead Veeam procurement capability. Veeam was in a state where procurement happened, and it happened fine, if you will. But at some point, company grows and it needs to happen in a much more mature way, which also spiked the transformation that we'll talk about, I'm sure, later today. And I was really tasked to further evaluate already existent best practices at Veeam and broadening them really across the company, as well as to introduce new ones where, of course, it made sense. And part of that was really looking at automation, simplifying and accelerating procurement and travel systems and processes that were within Veeam. And that did include evaluating and rolling out a company-wide source-to-pay platform that allowed Veeam, in general, Veeam teams across the globe to move even faster.
Sure. And of course, then this is a transformation. So you arrived and it wasn't start from scratch. You were building on something that already existed. So what were you greeted with in terms of the procurement space when you first joined?
Well, I think the first thing that really stood out to me is that people were absolutely exhausted. People within procurement, people around procurement, and people could really barely keep their heads up above the water with a huge backlog of contracts that existed, and stakeholders were complaining on the procurement black hole, what they called it. And procurement really was an administrative discipline. It was very manual, it functioned, but it didn't look at the spend strategically, and there was no categories, no metrics around it, nothing. It simply just processed the paper, right? A model like this actually does work for small organizations until a company grows to a certain size. And procurement can happen ad hoc, and really anyone can do it, to an extent. But then when you really need to think about how the spend is done and do it smartly and negotiate contracts and do the planning around it, et cetera, you do need the process, and you do need to look at optimizing how you do this. So the company's really come to a point of evolution on when you must build up the best practices. Built up on the best practices that you have already and introduce the new ones, and eventually really transforming an organization. And that was the point when I came in to Veeam.
Sure. And then, so what would you say were your first steps? What were the first things you looked to change and looked to kind of bring in and implement?
First and foremost, really was to listen and understand what was needed. You don't really want to jump into change immediately, right, without the understanding what the environment really looks like, what the organization looks like, what goals organization has, and only understanding those components, you can then design a proper organization. And that's exactly, I think, what I did. Those were my first steps, is to really understand the Veeam business, the stakeholders, the needs, and ask myself a question as I'm doing all this, and questions of my peers and colleagues and everyone within Veeam. What kind of procurement organization did Veeam need? In parallel with that, I analyzed spend, evaluated resources, which, again, like I said, were really overworked, and baseline then current state. And for us, it resulted in identifying several key gaps. And those gaps really needed immediate attention. And the evolution journey, I would say, began from there.
And so you mentioned then that there were gaps that you identified. Obviously that needed that attention. What were some of these gaps?
Yeah, so there's three major ones. One was the operating model that simply couldn't sustain the volume of transactions. So for various reasons, really from the manual processes that I was mentioning earlier to just the volume of contracts that existed, to the speed with which Veeam stakeholder organizations were moving and expecting for procurement to react in the same fast manner. And all of these interdependencies and linkages with other departments, how did it all work together, right? For example, with legal, with finance, with IT. So the overall end-to-end operating model and proper organizational structure had to be designed. So that was the first one. The second one were the critical roles. You cannot do a transformation. You cannot effectively operate. You cannot effectively run the business without having critical roles in place. So there were a couple that were missing, and we addressed them straight away. We brought in the director of procurement operations, and we brought in director of global contracts. And those two roles have been key and instrumental to our success. And the third one is really the process, right? So once the process blocks were laid out on paper, as a part of the overall end-to-end cradle-to-grave cycle, candidates for automation are simply jumped out at you. Existing processes were so painfully manual, and teams were in such large backlogs that transformation was simply inevitable.
Sure. So we've talked about, obviously you've taken the first few steps. You've looked at what needed to be changed and what needed to be implemented. How did you begin then the procurement transformation? How did that process start?
The first with automation basics were probably the first steps that we looked at. There is a smaller, kind of a low-hanging fruit, if you will, right? Things that you can address, and then there's a bigger chunk. So we looked at both. So first, we began with the automation basics around the manual steps. That was simply taking too long because we were doing two things in parallel, transforming and getting out of the backlog. Because as we're going through transformation, business still needs to operate, right? Contracts still need to be done, spend still needs to happen, et cetera, et cetera. And so we automated some steps, like we removed the manual mailboxes. We created a centralized procurement space on the corporate intranet where people could, across the company, could go in and do the tracking of all of their procurement activities, as well as procurement people themselves could see activities, and we could now measure and baseline. Second, in those countries where it was allowed by law, we launched electronic signatures. So Veeam was 100% manual when I joined, meaning every contract we've done, we had to hand sign and then ship across the globe. So as you can imagine, that took a long time. So once we implemented DocuSign, we saw a 72% improvement in obtaining the signature. That was a huge, huge improvement for us. Really allowed for teams to move faster. And there were some other smaller tweaks and improvements we've done, but the key next one was really companies' decision to invest into a full source-to-pay system. We have gone through an extensive and detailed RFP. So procurement does drink its own Kool-Aid, if you will. We did a full RFP to find the right platform, the right implementer for us. And many stakeholder organizations, many future users and executive, et cetera, participated. And eventually going through this process, we have selected Coupa as our spend management platform of choice and KPMG as our implementer.
So it's interesting there you talk about implementers then. How important are implementers to this journey? And do you believe that they are you always need one? And is it possible to perhaps do a platform implementation using only in-house resources? Or do you definitely need that implemented to help out?
Well, so it really depends on the complexity of what is being rolled out and how simple or not simple it is to implement a particular system or platform. So, for example, the electronic signatures that we've done, we rolled out with internal resources only in partnership with the technical team from DocuSign in this case, so with the supplier themselves. And a more complex implementation, such as source to pay, you definitely require an implementer, in my opinion. So I know some of my colleagues, peers throughout the industry. I remember speaking at events and some other areas, and some have tried it themselves. And there are definitely learnings, and the biggest learning is don't do it yourself, get an implementer. Implementers, they allow you to go deep into the process. They really lead you through change management, which I think is a huge component of implementation of a source-to-pay system. And when we decided that we needed an implementer, we actually have gone through a very thorough side-by-side RFP, selecting an implementer to the platform in parallel to the platform. And the way we've done it, we had each platform bidder submit certified implementer recommendations for implementing their platform. So, for example, Coupa suggested KPMG, right? So that's the combo, if you will, that we've evaluated. And we were looking not only for the tech skills, but also for process transformation expertise, the global reach, and probably most importantly, culture and style match to Veeam. And we were looking for the best value. So upon RFP completion, there was a very strong preference for a well-known KPMG, who we have partnered with as a part of our source-to-pay journey. So no, you don't always need an implementer, but for complex implementations to be successful, this really needs to be a three-way dance. And in our case, we kept a close tie between all the involved parties, which is Coupa, KPMG, and Veeam.
And what would you say then are, and also should I say were, some of the biggest challenges you had to face during this implementation and throughout the journey as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think just having a look in the mirror, really, change management, and an honest look at our processes. Again, things aren't broken, they're just growing, right? And when you grow, your processes need to change or they need to evolve. And that's not always easy. So really an honest look at the process and change management were the biggest ones. The system will only do what you tell the system to do. And really in those instances where, for us, the process didn't make sense any longer, it had to be redesigned and adapted. And in those instances where there was no process, one had to be created and adopted. And we've had, I remember we've had several design sessions, design workshops led by KPMG with our procurement teams, finance teams, technology and stakeholder teams, all in person present, and we worked through the process. And I really think that helped, right, to level set people and really talk things through and design a process that works. Another big challenge, which I'm sure is not unique to Veeam only, was the master data cleanup. And, as we were getting close to completion, we encountered a problem with the way our supply data has been set up in ERP over time. And it would have taken us months, set us back quite a bit on schedule. And we had to get a dedicated resource cleanup team to take care of this data and update the ERP. And what happened is we have looked around how else can we do it, right? And one thing that came up is we were truly saved by Consus, another technology implementer, who used their own AI tool to quickly clean up a large database of suppliers' records in the ERP, saving really a lot of manual work and shaving months off of what would have been the manual work and put us back on track with implementation schedule.
And, obviously then when talking about, you mentioned ERP and talking about certain technologies and implementation, it coincides with a wider conversation across just sort of procurement in general about some of the key technology trends and buzzwords that are being thrown around. What are some of the technology trends that are affecting procurement right now, and kind of what do they mean to you?
Great question. So I think big data really continues to dominate just about any market. Certainly procurement can't ignore it and must take time to understand it and integrate it into its processes and benefit from it. I think the partnerships between CPOs and CIOs need to work very tightly, very closely to bring the best solution to their companies. And further, though, the challenge for procurement specifically, in my opinion, is to be fast enough to actually use the available analytics and create an environment of the smart balance, if you will, between long-term planning and budgeting and shorter-term business needs, and which is what I call agile procurement, right? Being flexible and seeing and knowing how to adapt and how to move fast. Some other cool stuff to watch for is machine learning, I think, and how it can be applied in procurement. For example, a Boston tech startup, Fairmarket, uses machine learning to automate sourcing and corporate spend, tail spend. How cool is that? Usually when we look at procurement and addressing the spend, you look at the biggest buck, the biggest spend. And what Fairmarket does is they apply machine learning to go through your tail spend and take care of that. So usually, not only that's an easy solution to implement, but usually customers see and realize an average of 6 to 12% savings. And because it automates the process and searches through your existing tail spend, I do think Fairmarket is a company to watch for. Quite unique. So that's a cool trend. Another one is supplier networks. And in general, how they're starting to appear in consumer app-like features. So, for example, chat rooms and category rooms and catalogs, etc. I think the more spend management platforms become mature for enterprises, the more we will see category management software apps and chat rooms gain momentum and progress.
And as part of your role, you mentioned, obviously there was procurement, there was sourcing, but there was also global travel operations. And sticking with sort of trends, what can you kind of tell me about particular trends that are impacting business travel?
Yes, this is a very interesting area. I think business travel industry is going to go through a change, and there's going to be a lot of momentum within the next few years and a lot of spotlight to them. But I'm observing that nowadays we're really starting to see disruptive new business platforms introduce the human psychology, if you will, into the business travel and blend it with technology. So, for example, reward systems are being used to incentivize business travelers to book even more cost-effective, company-compliant travel alternatives. And that really saves money, brings savings to an enterprise. The other thing you see is really platforms like Uber and Airbnb really starting to pick up for business travelers. So, for example, the launch of Uber for Business or Airbnb for Business is beginning to become more and more common for business travelers. And so I believe we'll definitely see more in this space in the next few years.
Absolutely. And I understand then that Veeam, particularly from a procurement perspective, worked quite closely with Gartner. Can you tell me a bit more about what role Gartner played in terms of this transformation and just in general towards procurement?
Sure. So we always look at industry analysts and researchers such as Gartner and Forrester, etc., to understand and keep ourselves sharp and what's going on, what they're seeing, right? Just to have a true 360-degree, if you will, view and analysis. And I mean, they spend a lot of time evaluating companies. So we do look for that intel. So for source to pay specifically for our RFP, we have looked at the magic quadrants. We looked at cons and pros for each player, and the space around them, if you will. And then we took that into account with our own selection criteria and made a decision based on that. And in general, when we do RFPs, we take the approach of making sure that we include that industry view as well. It doesn't mean we're always going to go with whoever the leader is, right, say in the magic quadrant. or a suggested, up and coming leader, but we definitely look at that, and that makes that helps us form a decision a little bit more educated.
So would you say that procurement professionals must make the extra effort to ensure that they understand company business so that they don't just focus on procurement, they understand the wider strategic direction of a business?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think understanding the business is key for a procurement professional. You will never negotiate a good contract if you don't understand what your business is and what your company does. And by the way, I don't think these are extra efforts that you need to go through. I think these are basic job requirements for a procurement professional.
And sort of sticking with the professional then, as you know, we've talked about technology, we've talked about transformation and process. How important will people remain to procurement as we become more technologically focused?
People are extremely important to procurement, and in today's world, effective and modern procurement organizations should look at technology to automate many of these basic procurement tasks. And provided real-time analytics and a lot of other cool stuff. So you take advantage of that. However, when you think about negotiation a complex deal, you will not have a system negotiate that for you, right? In order to get truly the best deal that works for both companies, a true partnership, you need a strong negotiator for that, and you need to build relationships. You need someone who understands the business, truly skilled, and a person that builds relationships, understand the salespeople and the sales cycle, because guess who's on the other side when you negotiate, right? They're salespeople. And by the way, great negotiators are hard to find. When you find them, you better keep them, develop them further, and have them train others. So I think people are extremely important on all kinds of levels, right? As machine learning, as systems come up, human factor is what's going to do the strategic, the big, the directional, right? The big items, truly big and strategic items, and people are extremely important.
No, absolutely. And something that, or so say, a phrase that I hear a lot when I speak to people in the procurement space is procurement excellence. And there's a number of companies that are currently investing in establishing procurement excellence. How would you then describe what procurement excellence is and what it means?
Sure. I think it's actually quite simple. To me, procurement excellence means really understanding your business priorities and goals, and then aligning your procurement strategies and deliverables and outcomes to drive business forward. For Veeam, for example, at Veeam, what we've done is we have set out direction a year and a half ago, and it hasn't changed since. For us, it's really making buying an easy mobile experience aligned with the corporate strategy. We enable employees to buy goods and services quickly, safely, and mobile and cost effectively, while maintaining overall visibility and control to further fuel investment in the business top line. So I think connecting the dots between what's important to the company and then how do you procure, how do you buy, is really what defines your procurement excellence. Everything else, your org structures, your disciplines, your practices, your systems, etc., is simply support that.
And sort of coinciding then with this kind of understanding that the procurement role and the function even, and the role it plays within a wider business is evolving and is becoming far more strategic compared to a traditional view of it just being a bit of a side function. Do you think then that despite that, there is still a bit of a lack of an understanding, particularly towards the role of the CPO?
Absolutely. Oftentimes, CPOs are still viewed very transactionally. They're viewed as an internal administrative hurdle, if you will, to overcome. Someone whose organization will only make sure that the contracts are done right with proper terms, etc., etc. Someone who sets and runs controls and enforces policy around buying process. Someone who cares about, the only thing is savings and the costs. If I may. However, I think these so-called administrative musts are just the foundation to the services CPOs must provide and offer to companies. And role of a modern CPO implies taking the time to understand the business and only then design and run best possible practices. The role of a CPO is the role of a business partner, truly a business partner. The role of a CPO is really to design and run a procurement organization that supports the business priorities and needs, that can adapt to ever-changing business and business needs.
And then with that in mind, what would you say makes for a good CPO?
So I think, a few things. Definitely clear vision and ability to communicate it. Relentless drive to make things better. Outstanding leadership qualities and ability to build strong teams. Speaking of people. And probably last but not least is honesty and integrity.
And I guess then my sort of final question for you, just following up on that, is how do you personally go about ensuring that you can tick off those 4 things? Like, what do you do to ensure that you are remaining, with a clear vision and being able to communicate it? What do you do to, achieve those?
I really made that a practice of my career and my life, actually. And it's not, to me, I love what I do. So to me, every day, if you will, in the office is a reflection of what I believe in. And I'm a visionary leader. And I think to create that vision is the foundation for all, but you cannot do it yourself. So in the instance of Veeam, and actually in the prior roles, be it when I worked at Baker Hughes or Philips or HP, and then the roles that I've had, you set the vision and then you work it with the people around you, with your stakeholders, your customers, your teams, to further refine it, and you help them see that postcard, that destination postcard, and then once it's set, right, then you communicate it out. So definitely practice that. I'm such a believer in you can always do things better and you can always improve. It never stops. Right? Transformation is a never-ending journey, really. You can have major milestones, but if you stop transforming, if you stop changing, you're really going in the wrong direction. So I think that drive, it's just there. Everything is, it has to be honest in order to work in a space of procurement, working with contracts. You have to, you just by nature, you have to be like that. And I think that's just how my parents raised me. And integrity. And I'll tell you one thing that I tell to my kids all the time is something that I picked up from actually a leader years ago back at HP who led procurement organization back then, Nick Gunn. I remember he was saying on stage, how do I know if I'm doing the right thing? I think about it, and if this is something that I can tell to my kids in the evening that I've done, then do it, right? And if you hesitate, if you can't tell that to your kids, you probably shouldn't do it. So if you're ever in doubt, right, this kind of stuck with me, and this definitely has been a guiding principle to myself, and I teach that to my children as well. So honesty and integrity is absolute foundation. And the people, I'm extremely proud of the teams we've built. I think everything that was accomplished ever really in my career, not only at Veeam, but anywhere, has always been around the people and the best people out there, finding them, inspiring them, working with them, making things happen for them. And when you listen and they believe in what they do and love what they do, a magic really happens.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with theinterface.net and CPOstrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. And don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/podcast.